as it relates to who can or cannot be successful. And I think that, you know, there would have to be, along with this, some initiative on our campuses led by our executive leaders that would help shift the culture of faculty and give them the type of development that is needed to be able to handle the responsibility of using data for student success. So I just want to say that and leave that in the room for a minute, and perhaps someone might have a comment about that at the end, but I do want to give Bridget an opportunity to share her thoughts about this.
Well, I do think that there is a bit of a boogeyman problem. Like, people think that predictive analytics, first off, they assume it's some panacea, that's some kind of going to solve all the problems. A lot of the time I talk to presidents who say, oh, we have predictive analytics. And I look, and they don't. They have a vendor contract. They haven't even transferred their data. They've tasked one person with the responsibility of implementing it, and they have no idea actually how difficult this is. I think that, you know, too often people are looking for a story to justify the status quo, and I think it's a very convenient story to believe that predictive analytics is somehow the devil, or that people have malicious intentions. Like, honestly, the folks I work with, who are primarily administrators on the ground, they all deeply care about this problem. They deeply care about students, and I don't believe anyone's twisting their mustache. I think that too often what we have is that administrators are really overburdened, and that that our data has never been set up in a way to serve us. It's often in like 3 to 9 different disparate systems. It's almost like it's in a bunch of dirty boxes in our basement. Nobody's ever thought about who the user is for data. So when you talk about advisors, I mean, I think that's the primary audience. That, you know, one of the most telling things I do when I go from campus to campus is I ask academic advisors, how many screens do you have to look at? When you sit with a new student, how many screens do you have to look at before you can diagnose the problem? And I've heard numbers as high as 9, which is ridiculous. These people get 30-minute appointments. So, you know, to think that somehow it's not in the best interest of students to give those folks what they need as quickly as possible is just missing the point. And then I think that there's some examples. So people were super freaked out about Georgia State doing predictive analytics, and they're, oh, you know, you're going to be pipelining African-American students into easier majors, or you're going to be doing, you know, there's all this worry. Their number one change that's happened is that they've had the number one increase in majors is an increase in biology. Students are going from general studies to biology. That's what they're seeing at the highest level. So, you know, that didn't happen, and they've been at it, and they're the national model for how to do this. I think, yes, there are possibilities for all kinds of behavior, but none of this happens in a vacuum, and I just think that at the end of the day, if we would start with empathy and start with really looking at the problem, I think design thinking is helpful. I think just looking at how institutions were not designed around students. They just weren't. They were designed around the work we needed to do. And there are lots of decisions that were made by well-intending folks that have set up booby traps and landmines that are unintentional. And I think we have a moral and ethical obligation to actually think about and reflect on all these different experiences we've had with students over the past, 100 years, decades at least in most institutions. We actually know that if you take that one class, there's something going on there, but that's actually a road that's not going to help you be successful. Or we know that if you do X type of behavior, you're not going to be as successful. If we don't integrate that learning into what we do, I just don't think we can look ourselves in the mirror and feel good about that. So yeah, I mean, we should be mindful about the potential downside, but at the end of the day, I just think that to assume that there are malicious intentions at play is totally missing that most people would not be working in this field if someone hadn't changed their life in some classroom. That's the reason why every person works in higher ed, and so I've never been disappointed when I have come with the spirit of knowing that they're on the right side, that administrators, that we want to do good work. So when Mark talked about the healthcare, I mean, I would say this, generally, I know we're supposed to debate, and I totally want to, get in there, but I agree with a lot of what you said. So what I would say, offer from my vantage point, I spent a lot of time going between institutions trying to figure out why there are some who have really figured this out and stood this up, or who have not. And what I found is that most of the time, institutions are not very self-aware about what's going on elsewhere, or even on their own campus. And that we follow shiny objects and buzzwords, and so people think predictive analytics is this thing. And it's not. It's much more complex than that, and it's not something that's sitting in in one person's hands. So what we do at the UIA is try and figure out how do we help institutions move faster at the adoption process if they want to move in this direction.
Right.
So in the last year, we started last year, we had 3 campuses who had predictive analytics. And typically, undertaking, integrating, and adopting predictive analytics is a very big thing. It's very hard. And most campuses think they just task like IR and CIO and maybe enrollment manager and here, go do this. And you need a team, and you have way too much on your plate. Administrators are totally overburdened. So what we found is that building teams across the UIA campuses, actually giving them an FTE to help shepherd and support this work, paying for them to travel between campuses to actually kick the tires and learn, what did you run into? What walls did you run into? What do you wish you knew before you started? That kind of demystifying and helping each other along the way, that's what's needed. And so we started with 3 campuses, and now we have 9. That means 2 of my campuses, Ohio State and Michigan State, they were a no. They were not going to do predictive analytics last year. And they went from a no to a maybe to a yes to a full-scale implementation. And that only happened so quickly because they had friends.
Yeah.
And too much of when we talk about high-level innovation that is about serving students, we just expect institutions going it alone is the right strategy, and it's just not. It's too slow. So healthcare, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, the 100,000 Lives Initiative, basically we do need to follow the pathway that hospitals have carved. They're in a similar, highly competitive environment where you're doing somewhat similar things, geographically disparate locations, and tinkering alone in silos in the dark will leave us, the 30 years behind that we have been in terms of innovation. So I think that we do need to follow that path. Let me think, what else did you, I'm not worried about pipelining. And I think that ultimately giving people the support that they need to fully implement this is important. At the end of the day, we found that it was this. The formula is leadership plus change management plus technology. That's it. And too often people think that if I just find a vendor that we have predictive analytics, and it's like, no, you need to actually have an explicit, direct goal that you needed to achieve. For my campuses, it's about eliminating race and income as a predictor of outcome and increasing the number of college degrees we produce. And the only way we can do that is by working together and by giving each other the team time and the energy and the support they need to be able to fully implement this.
And part of becoming, I couldn't agree more. I think, and part of doing this work is, one, just to kind of go back to your point about the ethics of this, is continuing to embrace some of the core tenets of, again, the ethics of do no harm. There's also the ethic of a student's ability to benefit, which means I think if we're going to use students' data, we have the ethical responsibility, because we're using student data crazily in the world of higher ed right now, but we're in general not using it to help that student. We're using it to help us. So I actually think the student has the right to benefit